Don't move! Hands up!
I'm a
Now!
federal judge. This is my home. Do you have a warrant?
Yeah? That's what they all say when they get caught somewhere they don't belong.
I belong here. You're on my property.
You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood. Get on the ground before I put you there.
At 6:42 on a Sunday morning in Coral Springs, Florida, the street was still. Sprinklers ticked across trimmed lawns. A few porch lights glowed in the early gray. Federal Judge Naen Ashford, 54 years old, stood beside her car in the driveway wearing a white dress and low heels, a Bible and handbag on the passenger seat, her keys in her hand. She was heading to early service the way she did most Sundays, quietly and alone. Then 3 unmarked black SUVs turned hard onto her street, engines loud enough to break the silence of the entire block. They pulled into her driveway in formation, tires barking against the pavement. 6 ICE agents stepped out in tactical vests, sidearms visible, boots heavy on the concrete. The lead agent, Brock Stanton, 43, moved toward her with one hand resting on his holster and the other pointing directly at her. "Don't move. Stay right there." Ashford froze, keys still between her fingers. Behind Stanton, 5 agents fanned out across her property like she was a target in a raid. No one announced a warrant. No one stated probable cause. No one asked a single question before giving commands. What Ashford didn't know yet was that minutes earlier, Stanton had keyed his radio and told dispatch he was approaching a residence where the occupant, quote, "doesn't match the address." That phrase, captured on the dispatch recording, would become the first piece of evidence in a federal investigation that would end careers, trigger congressional hearings, and settle for millions. But in that moment, all Naen Ashford knew was that 6 armed men had surrounded her in her own driveway, and not one of them saw a judge. They saw a black woman who, in their eyes, didn't belong. Naen Ashford was not a woman the system had overlooked. She was one it had elevated because she had earned every step. Born in Liberty City, Miami, one of the toughest neighborhoods in South Florida, she was raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a hospital custodian. She attended public schools where half the students didn't graduate. She did, first in her class. A full academic scholarship took her to Howard University, where she studied political science and graduated summa cum laude. Then came Yale Law School, where she was one of only a handful of black women in her class. She clerked for a federal appellate judge in the 11th Circuit, then spent over a decade as a civil rights litigator before being nominated to the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida. She was confirmed with bipartisan support 7 years before that Sunday morning. On the bench, she was known for being fair but immovable. She followed the law with precision and held every party to the same standard, including federal agencies. In multiple immigration cases, she had ruled against ICE for due process violations, sloppy filings, and unlawful detentions. Her opinions were cited in appellate decisions. Her name carried weight inside the Department of Justice. She had lived in the same Coral Springs home for 9 years. Her neighbors knew her by name. Her mail carrier waved every afternoon. Her lawn was maintained, her taxes paid, her life built with discipline and intention. None of that mattered to Brock Stanton. He didn't run her name. He didn't check the deed. He saw a black woman in a neighborhood that didn't fit his assumptions, and that was enough. Brock Stanton had been with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for 17 years, all of them stationed out of the Miami field office. He had built a career not on precision or professionalism, but on volume. High numbers, fast operations, minimal paperwork. Among colleagues, he was known as a cowboy, the kind of agent who moved first and justified later. He ran his unit like a patrol squad with no leash, targeting neighborhoods based on instinct rather than intelligence, stopping people based on appearance rather than evidence. His file told a story his supervisors had chosen not to read: 11 formal complaints from detainees and residents over the past decade, allegations of racial profiling, verbal abuse during stops, fabricated justifications entered into reports after the fact to cover baseless detentions. Every single complaint had been reviewed internally and dismissed, not investigated thoroughly, not referred to the Inspector General, dismissed. His supervisor, Deputy Field Director Vance Kellner, 51, had shielded Stanton for years. Kellner liked results. He liked agents who didn't hesitate, and Stanton delivered numbers that made the office look productive, even if the methods behind those numbers would never survive outside scrutiny. Kellner signed off on Stanton's reports without question, approved his operations without oversight, and praised him in performance reviews as, quote, one of our most effective field leaders. Among immigration attorneys and advocacy organizations in South Florida, Stanton's unit had earned a different kind of reputation. They called them the hunting party, not because of what they found, but because of how they operated, moving through affluent zip codes, stopping people who looked out of place to them, and building cases backward from assumptions rather than forward from facts. That was the man now standing in Nadine Ashford's driveway, hand on his weapon, voice raised, giving orders to a woman he hadn't bothered to identify. Stanton's first words were not a question. They were a command. Step away from the vehicle. Put your hands where I can see them. Ashford set her keys on the roof of her car, slowly, keeping her movements visible. She had spent decades in courtrooms watching defendants' rights get trampled by exactly this kind of approach. She knew what was happening. I'm a federal judge, she said, her voice calm and deliberate. This is my home. I'd like to see a warrant. Stanton didn't reach for paperwork. He laughed, a short, dismissive exhale through his nose that the dispatch audio would later confirm. Behind her, Agent Luke Driscoll, 36, 6 years with ICE, positioned himself between Ashford and her front door. He didn't announce himself. He didn't explain. He simply stood there, arms crossed, blocking her path back into her own house. To her left, Agent Tara Nolan, 31, held a department-issued recording device at chest height. The red light was on, but the angle was wrong. Nolan kept the lens tilted slightly downward, capturing boots and pavement rather than faces and hands. It would later be proven in the federal investigation that Nolan adjusted the camera's angle 3 separate times during the encounter, each time away from the moments of greatest force. Ashford asked again, "Do you have a warrant?" Stanton stepped closer. "Ma'am, warrants aren't your concern right now. What you need to do is cooperate, or this gets worse for you." She asked a third time, slower, louder, voice steady enough for anyone within earshot to hear. "I am asking you for the third time. Do you have a warrant to be on my property?" Stanton said nothing. Across the street, a door opened. Colonel Edwin Osei, 67, retired United States Marine Corps, stepped onto his front porch in a bathrobe, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. He had watched the SUVs arrive, he had seen the agents fan out, and now he saw his neighbor, a woman he had known for nearly a decade, standing surrounded in her own driveway with no explanation and no warrant. Osei raised his phone and pressed record. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The camera was steady, the angle was wide, and it captured everything Nolan's device was carefully avoiding. For several seconds, no one moved. Ashford stood with her hands visible, her posture still, her voice the only thing she offered. She had complied with every instruction. She had not raised her voice. She had not stepped toward any agent. She had answered clearly and identified herself 3 times. None of it mattered. Stanton's patience, what little he had carried into the driveway, was gone. He tilted his head slightly toward Driscoll, then looked back at Ashford. "You're being evasive. Get on the ground. Now." Ashford's voice didn't waver. "I am a sitting federal judge of the United States District Court. This is my home. You have no warrant. This is an unlawful detention." Stanton moved before she finished the sentence. His left hand clamped around her right wrist. He twisted her arm behind her back with a sharp upward pull that made her gasp. Her heels slipped on the concrete. Her knees hit the driveway first, then her shoulder, then her forehead. The sound was hard and immediate, skin and bone against rough pavement. The white dress she had pressed for church tore at the knee. A line of blood appeared above her left eye where her brow had struck the ground. Driscoll was on her within seconds, pinning her left arm flat, while Stanton wrenched the right one higher and snapped cuffs over both wrists. Nolan stood 6 feet away, department camera still running, still angled low, still capturing nothing that mattered. She did not speak. She did not intervene. She did not move. Then the front door opened. Elijah, 14, Ashford's grandson, stood in the doorway barefoot, wearing pajamas. He saw his grandmother face down on the concrete, blood running down her temple, two men kneeling on her back, her church dress stained and torn. He screamed, not words, just sound. The kind of sound a child makes when the world stops making sense. Stanton's head snapped toward the door. He pointed one finger directly at the boy. Get back inside or you're next. Elijah stumbled backward into the house. The door stayed open. From across the street, every frame of it was being recorded. Colonel Edwin Osei had not moved from his porch. His phone was steady, in his right hand, held at eye level, the camera capturing a wide, unobstructed view of the entire driveway. The audio was clean. The angle was unbroken. He recorded Stanton's commands. He recorded Ashford's calm, repeated identification of herself. He recorded the grab, the twist, the moment her face hit the pavement. He recorded Driscoll pinning her arm. He recorded Nolan standing still with her camera tilted toward the ground during the exact seconds the force was applied. And he recorded the moment Stanton pointed at a 14-year-old boy in pajamas and threatened to arrest him for standing in his grandmother's doorway. Osei's hands didn't shake. 30 years in the Marine Corps had trained that out of him a long time ago. Behind him, through the screen door, his wife Grace was already on the phone with 911. There are federal agents assaulting our neighbor, she said, her voice tight but clear. She's a federal judge. They have her on the ground in handcuffs. She's bleeding. There's a child in the house. The dispatcher paused. Ma'am, did you say a federal judge? Grace repeated it. Yes. Judge Nadine Ashford, Southern District of Florida. She lives across the street. They're hurting her right now. The call was logged at 6:51 a.m., 9 minutes after the SUVs had arrived. Before hanging up, Grace gave the address, the number of agents, and a description of the vehicles. Then Osei made a second call. This one to a contact at the Broward County NAACP chapter, a man he'd known for 20 years. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke 5 sentences. They just put Judge Ashford on the ground in her driveway. ICE agents. No warrant. I have video. Call everyone. Within minutes, that call became 2 calls, then 5, then 12. By the time Stanton walked back to his SUV, the chain had already reached Washington. He just didn't know it yet. They left her on the ground for 28 minutes. 28 minutes on hot Florida concrete in a white church dress, with her wrists cuffed behind her back and blood drying above her left eye. The sun had started to climb. The pavement was already warm and getting warmer. Ashford lay still. Not because she had given up, but because she understood that any movement could be used against her. So she spoke instead. My judicial credentials are in my purse. It's on the passenger seat. You can verify who I am right now. Stanton didn't check, didn't send anyone to look, didn't respond. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, waiting. Driscoll crouched near the SUV, running her name through federal databases. The process was slow. Not because the systems were slow, but because no one on that driveway was in any rush to admit a mistake. While they waited, Driscoll said something Osei's phone picked up with disturbing clarity. Judges don't live in places like this, not ones that look like her. Nolan said nothing. Down the block, doors had started opening. A woman in scrubs stood at the end of her walkway. A man 2 houses down recorded from a second angle. Inside, Elijah stood at the living room window, tears running down his face, both hands pressed against the glass, watching his grandmother bleed on her own driveway. Then at 7:10 a.m., a junior agent in one of the SUVs ran the property address through a federal database. The result came back instantly. The home was deeded to the Honorable Nadine R. Ashford, United States District Judge. He radioed Stanton privately. Stanton's face shifted. Not guilt. Something closer to calculation. He walked back, unlocked the cuffs, and dropped her wrists without a word. No apology, no explanation, no incident report offered. They drove away like it was any other Sunday morning. For a long time, Ashford didn't move. She sat on her driveway with her legs folded beneath her, one hand pressed to the cut above her eye, the other flat on the concrete. Her dress was torn. Her palms were scraped raw. The cuffs had left red welts around both wrists that would darken into bruises by nightfall. Blood had dried along her jawline. The Bible on the passenger seat was still there. The car door was still open. She never made it to church. Colonel Osei crossed the street immediately, his wife Grace a step behind with a towel and ice from their freezer. Grace knelt and pressed the towel gently to the wound. Neighbors moved toward the driveway slowly. Someone called paramedics. Ashford's hands were shaking. Her voice was not. She looked at Osei and said, "I need my phone." He retrieved it from the car. She made 4 calls in under 10 minutes. The first to Chief Judge Leonard Keene of the Southern District of Florida. She told him what happened in the same measured tone she used from the bench. He said one sentence, "I'm calling the administrative office now." The second to the United States Marshal's Service. She identified herself, gave her address, and described the incident. A deputy marshal was dispatched immediately. The third to her personal attorney. The fourth was the hardest. She called her daughter Simone and told her what Elijah had seen. Inside the house, Elijah sat on the hallway floor with his arms wrapped around his knees, still crying. He hadn't moved since Stanton pointed at him and said he was next. He was 14 years old. Within 45 minutes, a U.S. Marshal arrived. The Chief Judge had contacted the administrative office of the courts. The Inspector General's office had been flagged. The machinery of federal judicial protection had begun to move, and it was moving fast. Back at the Miami field office that afternoon, Stanton sat at his desk and typed his report. The language was careful. His unit had responded to a credible tip regarding a potentially undocumented individual at a residential address in Coral Springs. The subject was uncooperative and aggressive upon contact. Minimal force was used to gain compliance. The matter was resolved when the subject's identity was clarified on scene. No injuries were reported. He signed it and submitted it. Driscoll co-signed without changing a word. Nolan uploaded her department-issued camera footage to the secure server. The video showed the SUVs arriving. It showed agents exiting vehicles. Then it jumped. The 28 minutes in between were either missing or obscured by angles that captured pavement, boots, and nothing else. No takedown, no cuffs, no blood above the eye. No one, 4-year-old boy, standing in the doorway. No finger pointed at his face. Kellner reviewed the file that evening. He read the summary, scanned the footage timestamps, and initialed the report without a single follow-up question. No request for additional footage, no interview with the subject, no cross-reference of the address, just a signature and a closed file. None of them knew about Osei's video. None of them knew Grace had called 911 at 6:51 a.m. and identified the woman on the ground as a federal judge. None of them knew the U.S. Marshals had already been contacted. None of them knew that by the time Kellner initialed that report, the Chief Judge of the Southern District of Florida had already made calls that couldn't be undone. They filed their version of the story and went home thinking it was over. It wasn't. Within 48 hours, Osei's video had traveled further than any of them could have imagined. A copy sat with the U.S. Marshal's Service, another with the DOJ Office of Inspector General, another with the Office of Professional Responsibility, another with the Congressional Black Caucus. Each copy carried the same unbroken footage, the same wide angle, the same clear audio, the same 28 minutes that Stanton's report had reduced to one sentence. A still frame was extracted and attached to an internal DOJ memorandum. It showed a black woman in a white dress face down on concrete, blood visible on her forehead, a federal agent positioned with his knee near her back. The memo was marked urgent. Chief Judge Leonard Keene did not wait for the system to move on its own. He personally called the Attorney General's office. The conversation was short. The DHS secretary was briefed the same day. A phrase appeared in one internal communication that would later be cited in congressional testimony. "They arrested one of ours." That sentence changed the speed of everything. ICE leadership in Washington went into immediate damage control. Within hours, Stanton, Driscoll, and Nolan were placed on administrative leave. Their badges were collected. Their access to federal systems was suspended. Kellner was pulled from supervisory duties without public announcement. His pending performance review was frozen. No press release was issued, no public statement was made. But inside the Department of Homeland Security, the silence was louder than any headline, because they had seen the video. They had read the report Stanton filed, and they knew those two things told completely different stories. DOJ and OIG investigators arrived at the Miami field office within a week. They did not come to ask questions. They came to pull files. Every operation Stanton's unit had run over the past 4 years was extracted, cataloged, and reviewed. The pattern was immediate and damning. Of all stops classified under credible tips, 84% targeted Black and Latino residents in affluent neighborhoods. The tips themselves were often anonymous, unverified, and in several cases fabricated entirely by agents to justify patrol routes through wealthy zip codes where minorities lived. 12 prior incidents mirrored the Ashford arrest almost exactly. Residents detained in their own driveways or front yards, ordered to prove they lived in their own homes, questioned without warrants, held without cause. Not one of those 12 people was ever charged with a crime. Not one incident resulted in disciplinary action. Then investigators compared Nolan's department camera footage with Osei's recording frame by frame. The timestamps aligned. The angles did not. At 3 separate moments during the encounter, Nolan had adjusted her camera away from the action. Each adjustment coincided precisely with a moment of escalation. The grab, the takedown, the threat to Elijah. Investigators concluded the angle changes were deliberate and constituted evidence tampering. But the most damaging discovery came from internal emails. A chain between Stanton and Kellner spanning 2 years showed Kellner advising agents on language, how to frame reports, which words triggered OIG review flags and which ones didn't, how to describe force as compliant-assisted positioning, how to classify racial stops under community safety protocols. One email from Kellner read, "Keep it clean on paper and nobody looks twice." That email would be read aloud in a federal courtroom less than a year later. The Congressional Black Caucus held a press conference on a Tuesday morning in Washington. Behind the podium, a screen displayed a single still frame from Osei's video. A black woman in a white dress, face down on concrete, blood on her forehead, 2 agents above her. The image played on every major network within the hour. It was shared millions of times before sundown. Congressional hearings were announced the same week. Ashford was invited to testify. She declined. Instead, she issued a written statement that was read into the record and reprinted in full by every major outlet. "I do not seek attention. I seek accountability. What happened to me happens to Black Americans every day, except most of them are not federal judges, and most of them do not have a neighbor with a camera." The statement landed with the weight of a ruling from the bench. It was precise, it was measured, and it left no room for rebuttal. Advocacy groups filed FOIA requests targeting ICE field office operations across the Southeast. Op-eds flooded editorial pages. Legal analysts dissected the case on cable news. Civil rights organizations called for a full restructuring of ICE oversight protocols. And then the calls started coming. Former detainees who had encountered Stanton's unit began reaching out to attorneys. People who had been stopped in their own neighborhoods, questioned without cause, held without explanation, and released without apology. People who had filed complaints that went nowhere. People who had been told by the system that what happened to them didn't matter. Now they had a name attached to a pattern. Now they had video. And now, for the first time, someone was listening. The outcomes came fast. Agent Brock Stanton was terminated for excessive force, falsifying federal reports, civil rights violations, and conduct unbecoming a federal officer. His 7-year career ended with a single letter and a referral to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. His badge was collected, his credentials were revoked, his name was flagged in every federal employment database. Agent Luke Driscoll was terminated for excessive force, co-signing a falsified report and racially discriminatory language captured on Osei's recording. Judges don't live in places like this. not ones that look like her. That sentence followed him out the door and into a federal referral of his own. Agent Tara Nolan was terminated for evidence tampering, failure to intervene during an unlawful use of force, and filing a misleading video record. The frame-by-frame comparison between her footage and Osei's left no room for the word accidental. She had watched a federal judge bleed on her own driveway and pointed her camera at the ground. Deputy Field Director Vance Kellner did not wait to be fired. He was given a choice and took the resignation, but it came with consequences: loss of pension, loss of federal retirement benefits, and a formal referral for investigation into years of supervisory negligence, obstruction, and coaching agents to falsify language in official reports. Keep it clean on paper, and nobody looks twice. That email alone would have ended him. 6 additional agents from Stanton's unit were placed under active investigation. 3 were suspended pending review. The Miami field office was placed under a federal consent decree requiring independent oversight of all field operations, real-time review of use of force incidents, and civilian auditing of agent complaint records. The hunting party was finished. Judge Ashford filed her lawsuit in the same federal courthouse where she sat on the bench. The suit named ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, Stanton, Driscoll, Nolan, and Kellner, each individually and in their official capacities. The claims were precise: unlawful arrest, excessive force, Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a separate claim filed on behalf of her grandson Elijah for psychological trauma suffered by a minor witness who watched his grandmother forced to the ground and was threatened with arrest in his own home. The government moved to settle quietly. The first offer came within weeks. Ashford rejected it. A second offer followed. She rejected that too. Her attorney made her position clear. This is not about a number. This is about a record. The case settled for $4.7 million, but the money was not what made the agreement historic. Attached to the settlement were mandated national reforms to ICE field operations, independent review of all warrantless stops, mandatory recording protocols using tamper-proof body cameras, a publicly accessible database of agent complaint histories, and required retraining on constitutional rights, racial bias, and use of force thresholds across every domestic field office. Separately, the criminal cases moved forward. Stanton and Driscoll were indicted on federal civil rights charges. Nolan entered a guilty plea to evidence tampering and received 14 months in federal custody. Driscoll was convicted and sentenced to 3 years. Stanton went to trial. He maintained he had acted on a credible tip and followed protocol. The jury watched Osei's video, read Stanton's report, and deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. 5 years in federal prison. The gavel satisfying a debt his badge never could. 6 months later, Judge Nadine Ashford walked into her courtroom in the Southern District of Florida. The gallery was full. When she appeared through the side door in her black robe, every person in the room stood. Not because the bailiff told them to, because they chose to. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. Ashford said nothing about it. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and gavelled the room to order. The docket moved forward. She didn't reference the driveway. She didn't reference the blood, the cuffs, the 28 minutes. She didn't need to. Everyone in that courtroom already knew. Colonel Edwin Osei was honored by the NAACP at their annual gala for his role in documenting the arrest. He accepted the recognition in a dark suit, standing straight the way a man does after 30 years in the Marine Corps. He kept his remarks short. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I picked up my phone. That's all it takes." Elijah began seeing a therapist twice a week. The nightmares came less often now. With his grandmother's encouragement, he started a school project on civil rights and accountability. He presented it to his 8th grade class with a steadiness that surprised his teachers. In Washington, the Ashford case became required training material for every incoming DHS field agent. A framed quote from her written statement was mounted in 3 federal courthouses across the country. The law does not ask what you look like, it asks what you did. Back in Coral Springs, on a quiet Sunday morning, Ashford pulled into her driveway. She placed her Bible on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove to church. No SUVs on the street, no agents on her property, no commands, no hands, no knees. Just a woman in her own home, on her own time, unbothered, unbroken, and unquestioned. If this story moved you, don't just watch in silence. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to see what happens when power, racism, and accountability collide. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.